Rebecca Morgan folded the note into her palm and felt the city tilt. On the porch, Brian Wallace named her suspicious before the cruiser even slowed. Handcuffs bit her wrists while Mrs. Palmer's porch camera blinked a story into evidence. Her VA complaint, filed months ago, quietly waited like an accusation with memory. 30 minutes later, men in suits filled the station, and the air tasted like consequences. Some truths need witnesses, some betrayals were manufactured and paid for. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us till the very end. And if the story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. A thin envelope sat on Rebecca Morgan's doormat like a small, patient animal. It had been tucked halfway under the frayed edge of the welcome mat, the kind of place someone would hide a note if they wanted it to feel accidental. The paper was ordinary, the kind you might use to copy a recipe or scribble a phone number, no stamp, no return address. On the front, in a hurried hand, 3 words, "We saw you." Outside, the street held the last of the afternoon heat. June pushed itself across the neighborhood in thick, humid waves. Cars hissed past on the wet asphalt where someone had spilled oil days ago. The city hum was the same low-engined the world always made now, reliable and useless. The sun was sliding toward the roofs of low brick buildings, painting the gutters gold. A neighbor's radio leaked old country songs. Somewhere far off, a baby cried and then stopped like someone had closed the door on the sound. Rebecca crouched on the step and held the envelope like an instrument she had not expected to play. Her fingers were steady. A veteran's hands, she thought without irony. There was a quiet strength in them that did not scream. It simply registered and moved. She had learned to notice small things after the army, the way dust settled on a table, the precise angle light took through a window at 5 in the morning. Those details could be the difference between calm and panic, sometimes. She did not open the note right away. First, she checked the street, the little rituals that had become a map of safety after deployments and long nights of alert. Across from her, the florist was closing, umbrellas folded like exhausted soldiers. A man in a blue cap lifted a box of lilies into his van. Rebecca's eyes tracked the movement and then returned to the paper. A siren lost itself 3 blocks away. The world continued to move as it always had, indifferent to the quiet alarm that settled inside her chest. Up close, Rebecca's face read like a map of careful decisions. There were lines at the corners of her mouth that came from laughing at unlikely jokes, not sorrow. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid, the kind that did not get in the way. She wore an old army jacket that still smelled faintly of pine from a caretaker's house in Virginia, the left sleeve folded at the cuff where a patch had been cut away. At 36, she carried both the readiness of someone who knew how to act and the fatigue of someone who had been asked to act too often. The empathetic voice would say she was raw that day, closer than usual to the thin skin that covered old hurts. The impartial voice would record concrete facts. She had been discharged 3 years ago. Her name was Rebecca Morgan. She had an apartment above a small bakery, and she worked mornings at the Veterans Clinic doing paperwork and afternoons delivering groceries for a rideshare service. Both versions could be true, layered like thin sheets of onion. Inside the apartment, light slanted across the kitchen table where a mug still held cold coffee. A stack of mail lay fanned beside a chipped vase. Bills, an appointment reminder from the VA, a postcard with a photograph of a beach she had never seen in person. On the refrigerator, a magnet held a photograph taken 2 summers ago. Rebecca, in uniform, standing beside a younger woman whose smile was blinding. That photograph was a small promise to a life that sometimes felt like a different country. Rebecca opened the envelope with the same care she used to open letters from family, from old command. The single sheet inside had one sentence, underlined twice, "Watch what you do." The words were not a threat in the way a shout is a threat. They were colder, quieter, a weather report that told you a storm was coming. For a moment, the kitchen air seemed to compress. Rebecca felt the muscles in her neck tighten, a reflex she had practiced for years when plan failed. The note sat in her palm like an unclaimed order. She made herself breathe. She set the sheet down beside her coffee and went to the window to look out at the street again. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her. Steady eyes, a jaw set to keep promises to herself she had made in harder places. The empathy in her, the part that cataloged pain and refused to be defined by it, softened her expression for a second. She thought of the woman in the photograph, of crowded barracks and colder nights, of the small victories that made life bearable, an honest smile from a stranger, a day's pay that covered the rent. Rebecca also kept practical lists in her head. It was how she lived, who had a key to her building, how many cameras were on the route to the grocery store, the patterns of the neighborhood watch, the local stations, officers, the names she had been told to avoid, like potholes. That caution had been a shield and a burden. It had kept her alive in more ways than one, and it had hollowed out parts of easy trust. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket with the same casual motion she used to tuck a map into a uniform sleeve. Then she checked the time, 5 minutes until her next pickup. The app on her phone blinked with the small white that meant someone needed groceries. It was work, a small thread that held the day together. She could let the note become a shape in the background, not the whole horizon. Still, she stood a little longer at the window and watched the light change. The warm color deepened, and with it, the feeling of being observed, subtle like a weight shifting from one foot to another. Rebecca had learned to notice those shifts. She told herself she would call no one yet. She would finish the shift, drop off the groceries, and do her job. That was how she had survived before. One task at a time, a steady sequence of small completions that amounted to something like control. Outside, the streetlight blinked awake. The city sound thinned into a different rhythm as day moved toward evening. Rebecca shoved her hands into her jacket pockets and felt the paper against her hip, a secret she had not decided how to answer. She locked the door behind her and stepped down, the envelope a small coin of unease in her pocket, and the note's words moving through her like a cold draft under a door she had sealed shut long ago. The knock came while Rebecca was still tying a grocery bag at the back of her delivery van. It was a sharp, polite knock, the kind that belonged to someone used to getting an answer. She looked up as if expecting a friend. Instead, Brian Wallace stood on the porch, sunburned at the nose, his jaw set like a man practicing his best expression for a photograph. A boy stood beside him, shoulders tight, with a small man's anger. Ethan, Brian's son, who had been in Rebecca's passenger list earlier that week when she dropped off ice and cold cuts. The empathetic voice would say, Rebecca felt her muscles go small and steady, the way an oyster pulls shut, at a shadow. She had carried people like Ethan through worse days than this. She remembered the way his eyes had softened when she talked about leaving the army, how he'd asked if she ever missed the desert. He had never looked at her then with anything but brief curiosity. Now his gaze burned with accusation. Something in the air had changed, and she could taste it metallic and sharp. The impartial voice would record. Brian told her there had been a complaint. A woman had called. He said, someone from the Homeowners Association, saying a black woman had been seen taking things. Brian used the word suspicious twice, slow and careful. Rebecca showed him her delivery app, the route confirmation, and the customer's name, Mrs. Palmer. She held out her ID and the VA card in a plain movement. Her hands did not tremble. The app timestamp matched her story. The proof sat open in her palm like a finished map. But then Ethan pushed forward. He had a phone in his hand. His thumb hovered over the screen. You didn't tell us you were here, he said. His voice surprised her. It was small, but it carried a dangerous certainty. He said the groceries were late, as if lateness were a crime. Brian's face hardened. His eyes flicked to the street, as if waiting for backup before he named the accusation. Rebecca could see a little vein at the side of his temple, like the satellite dish of a worried man. Rebecca tried to smile, the way she smiled for strangers. Clean, slow, harmless. "I'm Rebecca," she said. "I was called through the app, Mrs. Palmer's order." The empathy in the narrator would notice that her smile did not reach her eyes. She tasted salt, her own sweat, or the coffee cooling in the van. The impartial voice notes. Someone in the doorway had already dialed. The voice on the other end sounded bored. It took an extra beat before it asked for a description. Brian described her, and the words were the kind that settled into a file. Black woman, loitering suspicious. The man at the line repeated them like they were facts, not interpretations. The dispatcher said the officers were 5 minutes away. Rebecca stayed calm. She placed the groceries on the doorstep and touched the bell. Mrs. Palmer opened the door, a small woman with layers of cardigan, her face the color of porch paint. "Oh, dear, I'm so sorry," Mrs. Palmer began, flustered. Rebecca handed over the receipt, the name on the screen matching. For a second, the world aligned, the delivery completed, the customer satisfied. Then the sirens rounded the corner like an answering chord. 2 officers arrived in a cruiser that smelled faintly of old coffee and car cleaner. Their names were Daniel Pierce and Mark Harlan, which the impartial voice wrote down, because names matter in reports. They stepped out in measured motion, badges catching the light in flat glints. Daniel asked Rebecca for ID. He glanced at her cards and then at her face. His voice was flat. "We have a call about theft," he said. There was no question in it, only the shape of a procedure. The empathetic voice would linger on the moment his hand hovered at his belt, the muscle under the badge twitching like a trapped animal. Rebecca felt a cold tighten in her chest, old training responding to a new danger. She offered her hands, palms open. "I've done everything by the book," she said. Her voice was steady, the sound of someone who had given commands in the dark and waited for them to be followed. No one answered that command now. The impartial account records. Brian's account differed from the app and from Mrs. Palmer's brief apology. He said he had seen her take something from the porch earlier in the day. Ethan nodded, adding precise details: the time, the bag shape, the way she had walked. When the officers asked to check the van, Rebecca agreed without hesitation. She opened the rear doors and let them look through insulated boxes, receipts, and a cooler with the meat still cold. The scanner logged her out. Everything matched her story. Yet Officer Harlan made a note of something else. A folded paper in Rebecca's jacket pocket, an appointment reminder from the VA, and beneath it, the small envelope with 2 words, "Watch what you do." He slid the paper out like a man showing a card trick. "What's this?" he asked. The tone was casual, but the look he gave her included a weight, suspicion made legal by the uniform. Rebecca felt the room was narrow. Her training asked, "Control the scene. Keep your hands visible. Speak in measured cadences." She complied. Her voice did not rise. "It's a note," she said. "Someone left it on my door." The empathetic voice would have noted that her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope as she spoke, as if it were both proof and threat. A neighbor, Claire from next door, stepped out onto her stoop at the sound of voices. She smiled, a small, safe smile, but she did not cross the threshold. In her hand, she held a garden hose like a leash. Her eyes avoided Rebecca's for longer than comfort allowed. In that hesitation, a fissure opened. The sense of community that had sheltered Rebecca felt thin and brittle. The betrayal was not yet a thing with a name, it was a slow decision to look away. The officers, having checked the van and spoken with Mrs. Palmer, decided to place Rebecca under arrest for suspicious activity, pending further inquiry. The words felt wrong, a bureaucratic label pressed over a living thing. Rebecca's wrists were clasped in cold metal that smelled faintly of iron. As the cruiser door closed, Ethan's face was expressionless, almost proud. Brian lingered on the porch as if watching a performance he had paid to see. The impartial voice records the time, 5:48 p.m. The empathy adds the small human detail. Rebecca's breath fogged the cruiser's window for a moment, and she pressed her forehead against the cool glass and listened to the city, cars, distant laughter, a radio playing nothing she wanted to hear. Inside, she folded the note back into the pocket where it had been and felt the paper, like a small promise, something else was coming. The cruiser's engine hummed like a restrained animal while the scene outside the station unfolded into a small domestic play of secrets. Inside the interview room, Rebecca sat with her hands cuffed to a metal ring on the table. The light above her was a single bulb that made the room seem smaller than the world outside. A file folder lay between her and the officer, its edges crisp like a promise of order. The empathetic voice noticed how her shoulders never quite relaxed. "You think too much," she told herself, a private reprimand learned on long watches when overthinking could save lives. She was thinking now in lists, what to say, what not to say, where to place her feet, so the officer's angle could not surprise her. Memory moved through her like a film strip. A bunkmate laughing in a mess hall, a night patrol under a low moon, the soft voice of Michael saying, "Come home," and then the hollow of goodbye. Those memories were a kind of armor and a kind of aching. Across from her, Officer Daniel Pierce set his pen down like someone aligning chess pieces. Daniel was the kind of man who believed paperwork could fix anything. The impartial voice cataloged. He had been on the force 8 years, married, with a thin gold band still catching light when he wrote. He called the world a set of reports. Anomalies upset him. When he looked at Rebecca, his gaze sharpened into the professional mask he used at press briefings. "We just need to clear this up," he said. The words were calm. The tone was not. Beside him, Mark Harlan watched the clock. Mark liked certainty and liked being sure people knew whose certainty it was. The empathetic voice watched the way his jaw worked when he smiled for an unseen audience. It was a small cruelty dressed as ambition. He had a hunger that did not sleep. Between him and Daniel there was a current, sometimes companionable, sometimes competitive. Daniel deferred to policy, Mark deferred to outcomes. Rebecca felt both at once, like two hands closing at different speeds. "Why would someone target you?" Daniel asked at one point, the question gentle but edged. The impartial voice noted his attempt at empathy. It read like a thought tested on a focus group. Rebecca looked at him and saw not malice, but a man trying to fit a stranger into a box he already owned. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe because I'm visible. Maybe because I work public routes. Maybe because someone is looking for a problem." Her voice held a brittle calm. Outside, in the hallway, Brian Wallace paced. Up close, he was not the solid man from the porch, but a stitched figure. A man who could not keep his temper seemed without effort. The empathetic voice understood anger as a language. Brian spoke it often. He had been raised to protect a yard and a reputation, and the idea of disorder made him anxious. His son Ethan clung to that frame of certainty like a talisman. Ethan's anger was raw, less polished. An adolescent needed to be on the right side of history without fully understanding the maps. "Dad, I did the right thing," Ethan told him later when they were alone in the kitchen. The impartial voice recorded the layout of the small house, the too neat stack of flyers on the table, the half-empty bottle on the counter. Ethan's hands trembled. He was proud and ashamed in the same breath. "She looked suspicious," he said, repeating the words he'd seen viral on someone's feed. He had seen a clip somewhere of a confrontation, and the clip had taught him to categorize quickly. The world on his screen gave him rules that reality had not agreed to. Claire from next door told a different story to anyone who would listen. She had been the neighbor who once watered Rebecca's plants while she was away. Now she found herself answering questions from other neighbors with a voice she did not recognize. The empathetic narrator lingered on the shame that made her tidy her mouth and smooth her cardigan when policemen arrived. She wanted to speak up for Rebecca. She had liked the way Rebecca helped Mrs. Palmer carry groceries, but something calibrated in her bones at the sight of a uniform. Fear can turn neighbors into strangers in a single heartbeat. Mrs. Palmer, the woman whose order had been a spark, sat at home afterward and watched the evening news. She had told the dispatcher a version that fit the tremble in her hands. Someone at her door earlier, a bag moved. The impartial voice registered small facts. Her hands shook because of arthritis, not fear. She had missed a delivery before, and someone else had taken it by mistake. But details made good stories, and stories made reassuring plots for small towns. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she told herself, then the television, then no one at all. Inside the station, Rebecca's internal monologue shifted from the professional checklist to a softer concern. She thought of Laura at the VA who had once said over coffee, "You don't owe the world your silence." The empathetic voice held that memory like a splinter found and kept. She wondered who would bother to listen if she spoke up. She imagined Michael's face, his patient skepticism, and felt the loneliness of someone whose truth must be declared in public to be believed. A twist hovered like a moth at the light. Daniel, by habit, filed reports that later became evidence in promotions and courtrooms. Mark, by design, sought headlines. Brian, by pride, wanted order restored. Ethan wanted validation from men on the internet. Claire wanted to be safe and thus chose the smallest risk, silence. Mrs. Palmer wanted reassurance she had not been wrong. Rebecca wanted only to be left in peace and to keep her job and her dignity intact. In the charged quiet, small motives aligned into a larger shape. Each character held a private ledger, small debts, small embarrassments, tiny needs, that combined built the scaffolding of a betrayal. No one had plotted together, no one had colluded. Yet the scene showed how easily human needs could intersect and how a simple complaint could be amplified into a legal action because three different people wanted, in their own ways, to be right. The impartial voice recorded the facts. The empathetic voice kept watch on the damage those facts would do to a person like Rebecca, someone who had given service of one kind and struggled to be served in return. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper. Rebecca watched the light move across the metal table and thought of small things. How metal chilled the skin. How a clock's tick could steady or unnerve. She had counted the tiles on the ceiling twice already. She did not flinch when Mark Harlan slid a thin folder across the table and opened it to show a stack of printed pages. The empathetic voice lingered on the way her hands kept their shape, even when cuffed, the quiet readiness that did not want to be dramatic but could not help being spotless. Rebecca's mouth was a straight line. Inside, her pulse had learned to measure danger by rhythm. Fast, then pattern, then plan. She read the top page before anyone told her what it was. The complaint, Mark said, as if naming it made it smaller. You filed a complaint with Internal Affairs 2 months ago. You claimed an officer used unnecessary force during a wellness check. He watched her, like a man who had memorized the way other people lost their balance. The impartial tally. Rebecca had, weeks earlier, spoken to Laura at the VA about an incident she'd seen at a late-night patrol. An officer pushed a man against a squad car, then laughed with his partner. She had given details, time, uniforms, a badge number partially seen. She had been reluctant, cautious. She had not expected it to matter beyond a paper file. That file now sat between them with a neat stamped case number. Rebecca did not answer immediately. She could feel the room close one breath at a time. I filed a report because it was the right thing to do, she said finally. Her voice did not run. I saw something wrong. I told someone who could do something about it. Mark's mouth tightened. The officer in question filed a countercomplaint, obstruction of duty. He claims you interfered with police business. He says you were aggressive, hostile. We have statements. He tapped another sheet. And we have footage now. Rebecca's stomach went cold at the way his words slotted into each other. Footage. She remembered the doorbell camera at Mrs. Palmer's gate, tiny, grainy, always angled a little off. She had never thought it would be anything more than a gentle inconvenience. Now the word footage folded around her like a trap. Daniel, who until now had kept a neutral face, cleared his throat. We pulled together everything we could, he said. Neighbors' statements, the feed from Mrs. Palmer, timestamps. His pen hovered as if against a line that might be drawn in ink. We need to know why you would file a complaint against one of our officers and then be at the scene of a suspicious activity call on the same afternoon. That question had edges. The empathetic voice found the familiar ache of being put in the role of suspect because you spoke up. Rebecca's memory flipped through small acts. The way Laura had clasped her hand, the taste of black coffee in an empty VA waiting room while forms waited against a clock. She had given a name and left it in a mailbox of bureaucracy, not as a weapon, but as a civic duty. She had never dreamed it would be folded back to hurt her. "Why are you looking for a motive?" she asked. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Mark's eyes were flat. Something doesn't add up. He slid a printed screenshot from a neighbor's social post across the table. The photo was blurred, but Rebecca could make out the back of a jacket and a shape that might have been her. Someone had circled a timestamp with a shaky red pen. Under it, a comment read, "Saw her taking a bag, black woman, around 4:30. The words had been copied into the officer's folder as if they were proof. Rebecca's name and the complaint she had filed were now printed on the same sheet, like two facts pressed into the same book. For a second, she saw, not with eyes but memory, how the pieces could be pushed together by hungry hands. Someone who wanted to discredit her would only need two things: a reason to resent her and a story to tell. The empathy noticed how her trust had been gambled away by the small practicalities of daily life: who watered whose plants, who remembered an odd delivery, who shared a link. "Who put that post up?" Rebecca asked. Her voice was steady, but the cuffs on her wrists hummed with containment. "Who actually called it in?" Daniel ducked his head, slow. "We traced it to a local account, an HOA discussion group. The original post was made by Brian Wallace. It was shared by neighbors." Claire's comment. Claire's name folded into the room like a cold wind. Rebecca saw the neighbor's garden hose and the polite smile she'd once known. The empathy recoiled at the idea of betrayal from a door 2 steps away. The impartial voice noted the web. Brian had posted. Neighbors had echoed. The post had been handed to the dispatch like an accusation wrapped in consensus. Rebecca thought of Brian's face on the porch, the tight set of his mouth, Ethan's phone raised as if capturing proof for some invisible jury. She remembered a small argument a week ago when she had mentioned to Claire that she'd overheard talk about the HOA's contracts at a neighborhood meeting. She had not meant it as an accusation. She had only asked if things could be more transparent at board meetings. She had not imagined that a question could be folded into a motive. Mark's tone changed then, from knowledge to something colder. "We also looked at your contacts," he said. "There are messages between you and someone listed as VA caseworker. You discuss filing. You were not anonymous in the ways we make complaints, and that's fine. But it's an odd time." Rebecca felt something small and sharp give way inside her. The sense that the system she had trusted to take complaints seriously could be turned into a tool to punish the person who used it. "I told Laura," she said. "I trusted the process." "And you trusted the people in this neighborhood," Mark said. "That apparently was a mistake." He slid a photo across the folder's edge. It was not from the porch camera. It was a crisp cell phone image, a selfie taken earlier in the day by Claire smiling, standing in front of Rebecca's van. The time showed a little before 4:30. The caption was casual. "Delivery lady again, looked odd." The photo's metadata, Daniel said, matched the timestamp on the suspicious post. Claire's smile on that photo changed from neighborly to weaponized in Rebecca's eyes. The betrayal was not the action itself, so much as the calm way it had been shared and amplified. The impartial voice wrote down the chain. Complaint, post, neighbor photo, dispatch call. Each link was small. Together they formed a chain strong enough to bind a person's life. Rebecca's chest felt hollowed by a new understanding. This was not a random incident. Someone had mapped the small facts of her life and turned them into a narrative that could be used against her. The thought of Laura in her office at the VA, a kind woman who had only wanted justice for another, and how easily that good could be tilted into harm, made her want to speak and be believed. In the hallway, muffled voices rose. Rebecca heard Brian's name whispered through the door as if it were a thing that needed no defense. Mark watched her, with a satisfaction that tasted like victory and something sharper, relief that a loose thread had been pulled tight. The first twist had snapped the view open. This arrest was not blind procedure. It was a direct hit. Someone had engineered the scene so the system would do their work for them. Rebecca folded that fact like a cold object into herself. She would later learn more: who posted, who edited footage, who had motives beyond the single moment. But for now, the betrayal sat clear. Neighbors she had trusted had fed the law a story. The empathetic voice felt plain and heavy. The impartial voice marked the fact. The incident had been arranged, not accidental. The cruiser's interior smelled of vinyl and stale coffee. Rebecca sat on the bench in the booking area with her wrists still marked by the faint red of cuff edges. A deputy took her phone, the screen lighting briefly in his hand like a small, obedient son before it went dark. He told her she would get it back when the process was done. The words were a promise and a postponement at once. Behind the glass, the station moved on like a different weather system. People signed forms, cups clinked, a radio murmured in another room. The impartial voice noted the procedural facts. Her name, the time, the charges, suspicious activity, pending review, and that she had been placed on hold until a supervisor could look over the reports. The empathetic voice watched how the small details landed in Rebecca's body. The muscle under her jaw tightening, the old training that kept her posture, but could not stop the old fear from blooming at the base of her throat. Outside, the neighborhood's mood shifted like a tide. Brian spread the version he wanted to be true. He had acted to protect his street. Ethan's post gained shares. A neighbor filmed the cruiser leaving and posted it with a caption that suggested guilt before fact. The impartial voice recorded numbers, likes, shares, a trending comment thread that built a case of social proof for suspicions, and noted how quickly public perception hardened into a shape that looked like judgment. Inside the station, Rebecca spoke, with a public defender on a phone that tasted like disinfectant. The lawyer's voice was efficient and tired. "We can fight this," she said, "but it helps if you have witness names, receipts, anything that shows you were on the record." Rebecca gave names, Mrs. Palmer's, Laura's, but the defense asked for more. Timestamps, CCTV links, someone to vouch publicly. The empathetic voice recognized the small, sharp realization that justice often wanted paperwork and witnesses more than moral clarity. Laura from the VA arrived later that evening, breathless, hands shaking from both haste and anger. She had pushed through bureaucracy and cut her own dinner short. She found Rebecca in a small interview room, papers arrayed like armor on the table. When their eyes met, something in Rebecca unclenched and then clamped back. Laura took her hand, and for a moment the world contracted around that gesture. "We'll get ahead of this," she said. The promise sounded like scaffolding, strong and honest, and, Rebecca feared, easily dented. But the station was not a place built for feelings. Mark kept his sunshine flat and his questions sharper. He watched the way Laura spoke and noted what he could use. Daniel, quieter, looked tired. His face held a small war between a desire to be fair and a pressure to close the file. Rebecca read them both with the same care she had once read a map. Only now the dangers were social coordinates instead of physical ones. A new element sharpened the danger. Word that her employer at the Veterans Clinic had received calls. The impartial voice recorded the administrative fact. A supervisor had called to say they had been contacted and that the clinic was reviewing staffing pending the outcome. The empathetic voice felt the small, hot panic at the thought of losing a job that helped pay rent and give purpose. The job was more than income. It was a tether to a life that made sense. Without it, the city felt wider and lonelier. At night, in the holding cell, Rebecca's memory curled and opened. She thought of Michael's laugh, the soft way he had said, "Come home." She thought of an old patrol under a moon that left everything in sharp white lines. The cuffs had a rhythm against the table when she shifted. The envelope in her pocket, the one with the note inside, had been photographed and logged earlier as evidence. The presence of that paper, its private warning now public, felt like someone had taken a private bone and put it on display to be gnawed at. Rebecca faced other choices that made the breath catch in her chest. Should she go public? Should she give interviews to clear her name? Or would speaking feed the social fire that had already started to heat? Would silence be dignity or a surrender? The empathetic voice felt the weight of all the small calculations. How to protect Laura's job, how to shield Mrs. Palmer from gossip, how to prevent Ethan's viral clip from rewriting the story into something more vicious. When Rebecca asked the deputy for a list of the witness statements, the man shrugged and said the reports were for investigators. "We'll request them through counsel," he added, the sort of bureaucratic distance that felt like salt. The impartial voice logged that request as another delay, another obstacle in the path between truth and public record. The empathetic voice felt the ache of delay, of waiting in the heat of being misread while the world grew louder outside. Word crept through other channels. At the bakery beneath her apartment, people paused in the doorway when they saw her picture on a neighbor's phone. A mail carrier hesitated outside her building for longer than usual. Claire avoided meeting Rebecca's eyes on the stairwell. Once, she pretended not to see her altogether. That small avoidance hung in the air like a suspended glass, something fragile and sharp that could cut both sides. Rebecca's options tightened. Plead and hope for mercy, fight and risk public hearings, or try to strike a private settlement that would leave her dignity intact, but her story unspoken. Each route had costs, legal, emotional, moral. The empathic narrator watched her calculate like a soldier on unfamiliar terrain. Weigh the risk of exposure, consider allies, count the cost of silence. In the narrow hours before dawn, Rebecca sat on a bench in a processing area and let the hum of fluorescent lights press on her eyelids. She felt simultaneously stripped bare and solidified, like a shell turned to stone by heat. She thought of the note in her pocket, "Watch what you do," and of how that small warning had become a signpost pointing toward something larger. Whoever had left it had meant to warn, but it had become a thread they could pull to unravel her life. The station door opened, and Daniel stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee. He did not offer easy comforts. He offered instead a thin hope. The supervisor would review the footage in the morning. Until then, they would hold her, a temporary measure that might become permanent. "We'll look closely," he said. His voice carried the weight of possible decency. The empathetic voice heard it as fragile as glass. The impartial voice marked it as procedure. Rebecca watched him for a moment, then stared at her hands. In that quiet, the hardest decision rose up, not whether to fight or yield, but who she could trust to stand with her when the world outside decided what story it wanted to tell. The station's fluorescent lights hummed like a held breath the morning the truth arrived. Rebecca sat at the same metal table where she had first been cuffed, but the room had filled with the weight of other bodies. Supervisors, a woman from internal affairs with a folder like a shield, and two men in suits who moved with the quiet certainty of people who never shouted. They carried badges that were not police badges. FBI, the letters almost clinical against their coats. Even the air seemed to recognize the change. It felt cooler, as if someone had opened a window in a house that had been closed too long. The empathetic voice noticed the small things. How Rebecca's hands, finally free of cuffs, trembled not from fear, but from the release of a long pressure. How her eyes tracked the men in suits and landed on Laura, who stood a few feet away with a look like iron wrapped in worry. Michael had called in every favor he could. His name had been on the chain of messages that pulled an outside agency into a local storm. The impartial voice recorded facts. The FBI had been alerted by internal affairs after inconsistencies in the timeline were flagged, and after a legal review suggested possible tampering with evidence and civil rights violations. An agent named Thomas Carter set a laptop on the table and clicked a file open. The screen filled a room with a flat white. Around the edges of that light, faces leaned in. The grainy porch camera footage ran first, an ordinary loop of sunlight and a mailbox, but then the feed switched. Another camera, a neighbor's phone, showed a figure turning toward the van at a time that did not match the delivery app. The image froze, and beneath it metadata scrolled like truth on a ticker, timestamps, device IDs, unexpected edits. The empathetic voice felt Rebecca's breath catch. The impartial voice noted how the edits were not mere compression artifacts but deliberate cuts. Agent Carter spoke without flourish. "We ran the metadata. The original post was edited. The timestamps were altered. Someone tried to make these clips line up." He tapped the table. "We also intercepted communications that indicated coordinated posts and payments between a private account and local users. This is not a misunderstanding. It's an orchestration. Faces around the room shifted. Brian's mouth opened and closed. Claire's fingertips went white on her purse. Ethan's phone slipped from his hand. The video he had recorded for likes now hung like a confession. Mark Harlan's smile, which had never reached his eyes, thinned into a line of calculation. Then Agent Carter did something that changed the room. He clicked to another file. It was bodycam footage from a night 2 months earlier, an officer's camera that had been flagged and then lost. The video showed a patrol, an unprovoked shove, a hand that laughed afterwards. The officer in the footage had Mark's voice, the same cadence, the same small annoyance when a man they shoved muttered. The room's air hitched. The empathetic voice watched Rebecca's face unfold with an emotion she had kept folded away. It was recognition, sorrow, and a fierce, exacting calm. She had filed that complaint. The facts were now undeniable. Mark stood, and his chair scraped like a drawn blade. "This is tampered," he said, voicing a pitch that sought authority and missed. Daniel, younger and flushed, made a small step forward. The impartial voice recorded the shift. The man who had carried out procedures now found himself in the line of fire. "We didn't," Daniel began, then stopped as Agent Carter looked directly at him with a softness that was not pity but careful clarity. "We traced a chain of custody break," Carter said. "Bodycam files altered, civilian footage edited, and posts coordinated. Certain officers had motives, complaints filed against them, reputations threatened. We also intercepted messages between a private account and a local HOA address promising payments for proof." He looked to Brian. "Mr. Wallace, you were seen transferring funds to 2 accounts connected to the social account pushing the post." Brian's face collapsed into something smaller than himself. Ethan's eyes filled, not with the pride of having acted, but with the realization that the thing he'd shared had been paid for. Claire's mouth worked. She found no words that fit. Rebecca felt a strange, heavy pity fold in on top of her hurt. The betrayal did not become less, but it took on human flaws, fear, greed, vanity. The room blurred in a way that felt like a wave breaking. Mark's voice rose, then dropped into the kind of silence made by the sound of an arrest. 2 agents moved with a quiet choreography and placed him in restraints. Brian was escorted out under a similar calm. Claire watched them go as one might watch a familiar house burn, stunned, hollowed, and unwilling to turn away. Daniel remained, his face a map of conflict. He had followed procedure, but his allegiance had been to an institution that could be bent by small cruelties. Agent Carter handed Rebecca a sheet with the Internal Affairs report stamped official. "We'll need your statement," he said. "What you filed was the start. You were right to speak up." The empathetic voice had room, at last, for something like relief. Rebecca felt her shoulders drop as if she had been holding a weight that she had thought hers to carry alone. Laura reached across and squeezed her hand. Tears slipped, hot and immediate, down Rebecca's face. They were not only for the harm done, but for the way truth had been hidden in plain sight, bent by small hands and sharp motives. Outside, the neighborhood watched through curtains and phones. The same audience that had once cheered small judgments now held in a different light. The impartial voice recorded that arrests had been made for evidence tampering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. It recorded that Internal Affairs would continue its inquiry and the FBI would take over elements of the investigation. It recorded, clinically, the beginning of the legal process. But the empathetic voice stayed with the human residue. People would say, later, that justice had been served, names on paperwork, court dates, the slow machinery of accountability. Rebecca felt that truth too, but she also felt the quieter things, the fracture in the neighborhood that might not mend, the look in Claire's eyes that would sometimes meet hers with apology or avoidance, the way Laura's hand still shook when she spoke. She thought of Michael and the way he had stood by her in the dark. She thought of the simple photograph on her fridge that had once promised a different life. When Rebecca walked out of the station that afternoon, the light was less heavy. The city kept moving. Siren, dog bark, distant laughter, but she carried with her a different shape, not the naive belief that people would always be kind, nor the hardened certainty that the world would always conspire, but the steadier knowledge that truth, once pursued, could arrive with force. She felt not triumphant, but weathered, not unbroken, but remade. In a quiet moment, later, she would fold the small envelope and place it on the table. Its message, "Watch what you do," was no longer a threat, but a reminder of something older. Vigilance was a difficult kindness. Justice had come not as a clean blade, but as a complicated, noisy thing. The empathetic voice lingered on the moral that doing the right thing sometimes meant being willing to risk everything, and that when systems fail, courage, quiet, patient, stubborn courage, could be the lever that made a difference. The weeks after the arrests had the air of a town that had been washed and never quite dried. People came back to their routines with the cautious steps of those who have seen a storm and counted the loose tiles afterward. Rebecca returned to work at the Veterans Clinic. The clinic director, a practical woman named Joan, met her at the door with a thermos of coffee and a look that asked fewer questions than it offered steady support. The impartial voice notes the facts. Charges were filed. Internal Affairs continued its investigation. Mark Harlan and Brian Wallace faced arraignment, and the HOA account that paid for hits was frozen pending inquiry. Court dates were set. Statements were logged. Evidence held. The empathetic voice stayed with the small, private consequences. Rebecca found that clearing her name in public did not smooth the private cuts. Claire stopped by with a casserole and a hand that shook when she reached out. Her apology was full of the little things people say when ashamed, "I didn't know," and "I'm sorry," that trembled like a leaf. It was not enough to unmake the betrayal, but it was a start of something messy and human. Ethan sent a short, stuttering text that said only, "I'm sorry." Rebecca read it twice. She did not answer immediately. Forgiveness, she understood now, was a choice she could give later if she wished, not a debt she owed. For Rebecca, the envelope with those two words, "Watch what you do," became a talisman with two sides. The empathetic voice lingered on the night. She sat at her kitchen table and smoothed the creased paper with both palms. She did not throw it away. She could not. It had warned her, and in a strange alchemy had also been the key to the chain that exposed a lie. She put it in a small wooden box beside the photograph of her in uniform and Michael's grin. The box felt like a ledger of what had been asked of her, vigilance and the cost of speaking. The impartial account records that Rebecca was offered a position to speak at a local community forum on policing and public safety. She was nervous. Public speaking had the old sting of standing under bright lights and weighing words for power. Laura stood with her at the podium. Joan and Michael sat in the front row. Daniel Pierce, once the officer whose procedures had been questioned, testified in the investigation and was reassigned pending review. He sent a short letter to Rebecca acknowledging procedural failures. It read like a factual admission with a thin apology attached. The letter did not erase his actions, but it did mark the beginning of accountability. In the weeks that followed, small reparations took shape. The HOA Community Fund was redirected to a neighborhood safety program that Rebecca helped outline: safe delivery routes, increased communication between drivers and residents, a neighborhood-verified app for deliveries. The empathetic voice watched how she insisted on meeting neighbors not to press wounds, but to build a practical shield so no one else would be weaponized by rumor. She knew, with an aching clarity, that policy could protect in ways apologies could not. There were nights when the old fear returned, when a horn sounded too close or a figure on the street moved away that tightened her lungs. The impartial voice records the therapy sessions she attended, the support group at the VA that Laura helped start for veterans facing civil conflicts. She began to write small essays that Laura typed and mailed to local editors. One column, titled simply, "If you see something, say something, but say it with care," ran in the city paper and stirred more reaction than she expected. People wrote back with stories of small cruelties and, in a few cases, with thanks for giving language to a hazard they had felt but not named. Rebecca's choices rippled beyond her. Daniel Pierce, confronted with the evidence and his own doubt, requested retraining and joined a citizens' oversight panel in a bid to bridge policy and community. Claire volunteered at the food bank and, slowly, began to show up at community meetings. Ethan deleted his social accounts for a time and enrolled in a community college class on media literacy. None of these moves erased the past, they were stitches, not ointments. The impartial voice notes that legal processes unfolded with the slowness and precision of gears. Some people were convicted, others entered plea agreements, and several officers faced administrative penalties. The climactic moral question, the cost of speaking versus the cost of silence, settled into Rebecca like a well-earned scar. The empathetic voice followed her the night. She sat with Michael on the roof of their building and watched the city lights breathe. "Did it feel worth it?" he asked, gentle in the dark. She thought of Laura's hand in hers in the interview room, of the way truth had come with a bruise and a bargain. "Yes," she said slowly, "but I wish it didn't have to hurt so many people on the way to what's right." That line, wish and acceptance together, became the frame of her reflection. She had learned that courage is not a single clean act, but a long practice. It was choosing to speak even when the map of outcomes looked faint, and being prepared for the cost that would fall on friends and neighbors who may have acted out of fear. She also understood more clearly the human currents that allowed cruelty to become effective: anonymity, small financial incentives, and the hunger for quick narratives on social media. These were systems to be dismantled, not simply moral failings to be scolded. In the end, Rebecca did something quiet and practical. She started a small nonprofit with Laura and Joan that focused on safe delivery protocols and civic education, teaching neighbors how to verify reports without weaponizing them, giving couriers clear channels for reporting harassment, and offering legal support for those unfairly accused. It was not a grand solution, only a piece of architecture built at ground level. The impartial voice records the grant applications and meetings, the modest funding, the local awards. The empathetic voice records the mornings Rebecca woke with the same tired readiness, but with a new edge of purpose. On the day the first workshop convened, Claire sat in the third row. Ethan handed out flyers. Daniel came, not as an officer in uniform, but as a man who had to answer for his choices. The room was noisy and human and full of small, real repairs. Rebecca stood at the front with the envelope in the wooden box beside her, a small history that taught her both vigilance and mercy. She did not believe the world would ever be simple again. She did not want it to be. The moral of her story, she thought, was not that truth will always win, but that truth becomes possible when people choose to hold systems accountable and to each other kindly, even after betrayal. The empathetic voice closed on her face as she began the talk, steady, weathered, and quietly fierce, while the impartial voice recorded the facts and the new pattern. A community learning to turn the tools of suspicion into mechanisms of safety and care. So, tell me, if you were in his shoes, mocked and underestimated, would you have revealed your success or walked away in silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that flip the script on arrogance.